But tonight is our fourth lesson, and we begin our historical background in the study of Revelation tonight. And this will probably last at least two lessons, maybe three, depending on how fast it goes. I definitely do not want to spend a lot of time on it, but the historical background to Revelation is very important to helping us understand the book. In fact, I don't think it can be understood if we do not understand the situation that existed in the day and time in which it was written, and the condition and situations that those Christians who were recipients of this letter, what their situation was. If we can understand what their situation was, then it'll go a long way towards helping us understand John's message to them. And this is certainly the reason for us trying to study a little bit about the historical background, is to enable us to see what their needs were, what their condition was, and therefore it'll help us to understand what John said to them. So this lesson then, and probably the next one or two, will deal with this historical background to the book of Revelation. Now, in order to have a good understanding of this, I'm going to go another step back, and I'm going to look at some Old Testament prophecy that deals with the establishment of the church, because the book of Revelation, the message is the conflict between the church and the world, between God's people and heathen nations. And in order to understand that conflict, I think it would be good for us to understand really who God's people are. What does the church mean? And so we're going to look at some prophecies. Now this Joel chapter 2, verse 28 through 32, is an 8th century BC prophet about what God's going to do in the latter days. And the latter days is the days of the Christian dispensation, the New Testament times, after the church is established. And it's called the latter days because these are the last days that God is going to be dealing with his people. And we learn this from the way the phrase is used. Like in Hebrews 1, we're told, God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in times past to the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. So the last days are the days in which Jesus Christ's message is effective. And of course this is now. It's the New Testament times, and which goes on into our time. So Joel speaks here of what God's going to do in the last days. And what he says is very important. Now we're not going to go into reading that, but in Acts chapter 2, Peter, in preaching the first gospel sermon, in fact, quoted this prophecy, verses 28 through 32. He quoted it almost verbatim. What God was going to do in the last days was pour out his Spirit upon all flesh, and old men would see dreams, and young men visions, and and it goes on there what they would do when God's Spirit was poured out upon them. In fact, in about Acts 2, about verse 14, 15, Peter says, these men are not drunk as you suppose. They were all speaking mysteries in the Holy Spirit. He says, but this is that which was spoken of by Joel the prophet. And so he quotes this prophecy here. So that's an important prophecy. Now we come down to Isaiah 2, a 7th century prophet. And in Isaiah 2, verses 1 through 4, God tells us some things there what he's going to do. He tells us when he's going to do it. He says it's going to be done in the last days, and he tells us what he's going to do. And he says the Lord's house will be established. The Lord's house is just another way of saying that the Lord's kingdom is going to be established. And then he tells us what the results is going to be. The results is going to be that all nations will flow into it, which means that God's kingdom, as it now is, the church which Jesus established, consists of people from all nations, all cultures, all tongues, all languages, everybody. It's a universal kingdom. And this is in fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy in Isaiah 2. And then he also tells us why God is going to do that. Why these people flow into it. Why do all nations coming into the church, to the kingdom, to be taught of the Lord, so that they can walk in his paths. You see, we can't walk in God's way if we don't know how. Now, we may want to, but if we don't know how, our want to goes unsatisfied. In order to fulfill our desire of walking in God's pathway, we've got to know how to do that. Well, that's what the church does. People come into the church to be taught about God's ways so that they'll know how to walk in his paths. And if it weren't for that, I wouldn't be here tonight. But I want to do this. I want to learn this so that I can walk in God's pathway. You know, we're promised by Jesus that the way to heaven is straight and narrow. And it's a difficult path. And few there be that find it. We have to search for it. But Jesus promised, he that knocks, to him it'll be open. And he that seeketh will find. So if a person is looking, if he's trying to find out what God's way is, he's promised that he will find it. But he's not going to find it if he doesn't look and try to find it. And then there's a fifth thing that Isaiah tells us, and that is where God's law will go forth from, and it's Jerusalem. That's why in Acts 2, the church was established in the city of Jerusalem to fulfill all of these prophecies here. And then in Daniel 2, we're going to look at Daniel 2 in a little bit more detail, but Daniel 2, verses 31 through 45, tells us what God will do. And what Daniel says is he's going to set up an indestructible kingdom. And so this is what the church is. The church is God's kingdom, and Daniel promised, or God promised through Daniel the prophet, and this is a 5th century prophet, that this kingdom would be set up. And then he also tells us when God will do this. And he says, in the days of these kings, and we'll look at that so that we can understand exactly when God's going to set up this kingdom, because Daniel 2:44 specifies that it's going to be in the days of these kings. And we'll find out who those kings are. And that's when the church was established. That's when the kingdom was established. So we look at those 3 prophecies to find that out. Now let's look at Daniel 2 a little bit more in detail. We find in Daniel 2 that it's a story of King Nebuchadnezzar, who's the king of Babylon, and he has a dream. In his dream, it just rattles him. He's really bothered by it. And he calls in all of his wise men, his astrologers and his soothsayers, and he asks them to tell him 2 things. Tell me what I dreamed, and then tell me what it means. Well, the king's smart, because he knows that if they can tell him what he dreamed, they can probably tell him what it means. But you know what they said? They says, you tell us what you dreamed and then we'll tell you what it means. He says, no, I'm not going for that, because I won't know whether you're telling me the truth or not. You tell me what I dreamed and then I can believe your interpretation of what it means. And they says, there's not a man on earth that can do that. Nobody can do that. No king has ever asked his counselors to do that. He says, well, I'll tell you what, if you don't do it, I'm going to put you to death. You and all your families, I'm going to kill you. And word went out. And Daniel, a prophet of God, heard about it. And Daniel went to Arioch, who the king's right-hand man was, going to carry out the order. He says, what's the rush in doing this? He says, the king said do it. He said, well, wait a minute. He says, I can tell the king what he wants to know. And so Arioch takes Daniel and he runs him into the king. He says, I've found a man, one of the captains of Judah, that can tell you what you want to know. And the king asked him, he says, can you tell me what I dreamed and tell me what it means? Daniel says, yes, I can. He says, well, do it. And so Daniel lets him know that I can't tell you what you dreamed, but there's a God in heaven that can. And he reveals secrets, and he has told me what you've dreamed and what it means. And he says, and I'll tell you what it is. And so if you look at Daniel chapter 2, now we're not going to go there and read that, but there's two parts there. He tells the king actually what he dreamed, and then he tells him what it meant. And in verses 29 through 35 is the dream. Daniel tells him the dream. He says, you dreamed of a big image. And he says this image had a head of gold, it had a chest and arms of silver, and a belly and thighs of brass, and feet and legs and feet of iron and clay. And he says, now that's what you dreamed. He says, now here's what it means. He says, the God of heaven has shown the king what he's going to do in the latter days. This dream deals with a long time to come. But he says, you are that head of gold. Talking about Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. You, O king, are the head of gold. But after you, he says, there's going to come another kingdom inferior to you. And he says this kingdom is the arms and chest of silver. But they're going to be inferior to you. And then after them is going to come a third kingdom, represented by the belly and thighs of brass. And then the legs and feet of iron and clay represent a fourth kingdom. So we know, we can go back, since Daniel says, you are the head of gold, and that's the Babylonian kingdom, and we can study secular history, and we know that the Medes and Persians, the Medo-Persian kingdom, followed Babylon, and then the Macedonian kingdom followed the Medo-Persians, and then the Roman kingdom followed the Macedonian kingdom. We can study that in secular history. So we know for sure what these four kingdoms are. Daniel says, now, in the days of these kings, so he's going to come back, and I should have put that up there, but I forgot to do it. But he says, in the days of these kings, talking about this fourth kingdom, in the days of these kings, he tells King Nebuchadnezzar what the God of heaven is going to do. And this is verse 44, and I want us to read verse 44. So if you turn to Daniel 2 and verse 44, we'll read that one verse because it's so important. Daniel 2:44, verse 44, he says, in the days of those kings, talking about these kings of this fourth kingdom, in the days of those kings, he says, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. So what's God going to do? In the days of the Roman kings, the days of the Roman Empire, God is going to set up a kingdom which is indestructible and eternal. Nobody can destroy it, and it's going to be forever. So there's two things we know about this kingdom. It's indestructible and it's eternal, and it's going to begin in the days of the Roman Empire. And then he goes on and he says, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. In other words, the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar was left for the Medes and Persians. The kingdom of the Medes and Persians was left for the Macedonians. The kingdom of the Macedonians was left for the Romans. But this kingdom that God's going to set up in the days of the Romans will not be left for another kingdom. That means that this kingdom that God's going to establish in the days of the Roman Empire is eternal. It'll never be destroyed, and there'll never be another universal world kingdom. This is the only one that will ever be. Now let's go on. He says, it will not be left to another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms. In other words, this kingdom that God's going to set up here will crush and put an end to all universal kingdoms. There'll never be another universal kingdom. And it will itself endure forever. So the church that Jesus established, the kingdom that God set up in the Roman Empire, is the last universal kingdom this world will ever see. There'll never be another one. Now that's what these prophecies mean. And we go on to verse 45. He says, inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy. So this is Daniel's revelation to King Nebuchadnezzar of what God's going to do in the latter days. And he says that in the days of these kings. Now if you'll study Daniel chapter 2, you'll see that this interpretation, you'll understand it a little bit better, that this was prophesied to be in the days of these kings. And that's what we're going to be looking at. The days of these kings, and we're going to start with the Roman emperors. And we're going to go down through Domitian, which takes us through about 95, 98 AD, when Revelation was written. And then we'll look at some Roman history after that, where the Romans were persecuting the Christians and trying to stamp out Christianity, killed them by the thousands. And that's what Revelation is all about, is this conflict between the kingdom that God established in the days of these kings and the Roman Empire. It's this conflict. It's the story of this conflict. And we're going to see that the church is going to win. The church is going to be victorious over the Roman Empire, so that it put a stop to it, and there will never be another world kingdom. And we can, to me, this is comforting to know today, because there's been a lot of people try to set up another world kingdom. You know, Mao Zedong tried it, Stalin tried it, Napoleon, Hitler, and there just won't be another one, because God has said that this kingdom will put an end to all them kingdoms, and this kingdom will endure forever. So we can know that. And we know that God rules among the nations. He gives the leadership to whomever he wants. And so it's God ruling. We've just got to understand that and to have enough trust and confidence that He is in control, and we just submit to His will and do what He wants us to do, and that's be good citizens of the kingdom. And that's really what our task is. So this brings us down to the beginning of what we're going to study. Now, of course, the Roman Empire started before Julius Caesar. We go back actually to 590 BC in our study of the Roman Empire. 590 BC, when actually it was begun, and it went through a lot of phases. It finally went, at the beginning it was a dictatorship, and then it went into a republic where people were elected and they were sent to serve as senators and so forth, and it was a mixture between a republic with a semi dictator who had a lot of power. Kind of like today, we've got a republic and we've got a semi-dictator that's got a lot of power, you know. And that's kind of the way Rome was until Julius Caesar come along, and then he was more or less declared dictator. And then after him, Augustus, Octavian, his adopted son, came on the scene, and he began the empire. Actually, Augustus is considered to be the first emperor because he had such power. He had almost all the power. And so he was an emperor, and he started the emperors, and it goes down in the West, I think, to about 330 AD, but in the East it lasted to 1453 in Constantinople, because the Rome and Constantinople split. When the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church split, well, religion becomes so engrossed in the politics of the day that the Roman Empire went from a Roman to a Holy Roman Empire. And then, and so we have a lot of church history involved there. But we'll get into that a little bit more later. But is any comment now before we get into these emperors themselves, Julius Caesar being the first one? Anyone have any comment or question? Well, we got about 3 minutes, so we'll talk about Julius Caesar. Now, Julius Caesar was born in 100 BC, but 48 he was had been involved in politics to the point that he became more or less the ruler, because he crossed. He had done so much. He was a very able politician in general. He formed the first triumvirate with Crassus and Pompey in 60 BC, and he extended the empire as a general to Spain, France, Belgium, and Britain. So all those victories that he attained in those years, about a 10-year period there, made him looked up to and gave him so much prestige that he had the hearts and minds of most of the people, except for the few senators that were afraid of him because they wanted to retain their power. And so they told him to give up his generalship and come to Rome. Well, he come to Rome all right, but he come with his army. And when he crossed the Rubicon River with his army, that was civil war. And so there was a period of civil war there, and he was victorious in these civil wars. And so when he became victorious, he was the man with all the power, and he began immediately to instigate a lot of changes, and he was declared dictator. But 66 senators joined in to assassinate him, and he was assassinated on the Ides of March 15th in 44 BC, only 66 years old, and a very able man, but he was put to death. And so he had adopted Octavian into his family before, and Octavian wound up being willed Caesar's heir. When they read Caesar's will, they found out that he had willed Octavian all of his possessions and power. Well, Octavian wasn't even in Rome. And so he came back to Rome to get what he had been willed, and he was warned not to take it because you're going to be put to death if you take it. But Octavian was just as capable as Julius was. He was a very, very intelligent and able man, and through many ins and outs, he wound up getting this power, and so he became Octavian Caesar from 31 BC to 14 AD, and he was called Augustus Caesar. And he's probably the most famous one of all of them, Augustus Caesar. And we'll stop there and start with him Sunday morning, Lord's willing.